The plains stretched endlessly around the McGraw ranch, but for Jacob McGraw, the world had shrunk to a hollow echo. Once, the land had seemed alive. Every sunrise painted in gold, every calf born a small miracle, every evening spent with his wife a quiet blessing. Now, after her death, those same sunrises were harsh reminders of a life that no longer carried joy. Jacob moved through his days like a man carved out of stone, steady, functional, but lifeless. It had been 2 years since her passing, though the townsfolk said it felt much longer. Jacob still wore his wedding band, tarnished from work and weather, and he had not set foot in town except for business that could not be avoided. The church bell tolled on Sundays, but he no longer answered its call. The ranch hands knew better than to speak of his wife in his presence, though they often spoke of how the house seemed more like a mausoleum than a home. Inside, her presence lingered in ways that tormented him. Her shawl still hung over the back of the chair by the hearth. Her Bible remained on the nightstand, a sprig of dried lavender marking the last passage she had read. Jacob had once tried to tuck these things away, to box them up and hide them from sight, but the silence afterward had been worse than the reminders, at least with the tokens of her life scattered about. He could pretend for a moment that she might walk through the door again. His vow had been spoken at her grave, carved into the earth as firmly as the headstone above her name. Standing under a slate-gray sky with rain soaking through his hat, Jacob had whispered words only the wind and the prairie grass had heard. "I'll never love again. My heart belongs to you and you alone." It wasn't just a promise. It was a shield against the unbearable thought that one day life might move forward without her. To love again would mean admitting she was gone for good, and Jacob refused to accept that. But the weight of such a vow bore down on him daily. Loneliness was a cruel thing, gnawing at him during long suppers eaten in silence, clawing at him when the night stretched cold and endless. He kept himself busy, mending fences, branding cattle, breaking colts, and pushing himself until his body ached. Idleness was dangerous. It left space for memory, and memory brought pain. Still, despite all his efforts to bury grief under work, the men on the ranch saw the change in their boss. He was harsher now, less forgiving of mistakes. Where once he might have shared a laugh at a clumsy ranch hand's blunder, now he barked orders and dealt swift reprimands. They respected him, but they also pitied him. A man so determined to shut himself off from life was like a horse running blindfolded, strong but doomed to stumble. At night, Jacob sometimes sat on the porch with a bottle in hand, staring across the moonlit fields. The coyotes' howls echoed like laments of the dead. He thought often of his wife's gentle laughter, the way she would tease him out of his silences. The memory cut deep, reminding him that he would never hear it again. And so he drank not for pleasure, but to blur the edges of memory until sleep claimed him. To the world outside, Jacob McGraw was still a man to be reckoned with, a rancher whose cattle thrived, whose fences held strong, and whose will could not be broken by storm or drought. But inside he was already broken. His heart had become a graveyard, and he had sworn to keep it that way. What he could not yet know was that life had a way of testing vows. The morning Clara rode up the long dirt road to the McGraw ranch. The prairie air was sharp with the bite of autumn. Dust swirled around her wagon wheels, and in the distance the ranch house loomed like a sentinel against the endless sky. Clara had not been there since her sister's funeral 2 years prior, and the sight of it now sent a tremor through her chest. The land looked the same, yet there was something changed in its spirit, an emptiness she could not quite name. Clara was younger than her sister by nearly 10 years, and though she shared the same striking features, clear eyes, dark hair, and a determined chin, her manner was different. Where her sister had been soft-spoken and steady, Clara was outspoken, quick to laugh and unafraid of hard work. Still, she had carried a quiet grief of her own these past years. The bond she had shared with her sister was unbreakable, and watching Jacob grieve from afar had been its own torment. She had written letters offering to visit, but he never replied. At last, with the ranch hands stretched thin and talk in town that Jacob was wearing himself down to nothing, Clara had decided she would no longer wait for an invitation. When Jacob saw the wagon from the corral, his jaw tightened. He knew that figure, he would have known it anywhere. For a moment, the resemblance struck him like a physical blow. Clara, with her hair tied back under a wide-brimmed hat, looked so much like her sister when she was younger that Jacob's chest ached. But as she came closer, he noticed the differences, the bold way she held herself, the directness of her gaze. Still, his heart rebelled. The sight of her reopened wounds he had fought to keep sealed. She climbed down from the wagon and greeted him with a firm voice. "Jacob, I'm here to help." Her words were plain, but beneath them lay layers of meaning. She was not asking his permission, nor seeking his approval. She was announcing her place, as though fate had driven her back to this house. Jacob, bristling, crossed his arms. "There's no need," he said curtly. "The ranch manages fine." Clara's gaze flicked over the cracked fence posts, the worn look of the cattle, and the exhaustion etched into his face. She knew better than to argue directly, so she tilted her chin and smiled with quiet defiance. "Then I'll just help myself. The kitchen looks like it's gone cold." That afternoon, the smell of bread baking drifted through the house for the first time in years. Clara swept through the rooms, scrubbing and straightening as if she had been born to it. To the ranch hands, it was as if sunlight had broken through a storm cloud. They greeted her with warmth and relief, remembering her kindness from years before when she used to visit. Around the supper table, laughter returned, a sound that had been absent since their mistress had passed. Jacob, however, sat stiffly, every sound of Clara's voice a reminder of what he had lost. At moments, he almost forgot, the way she moved reminding him of his wife in her younger years. Then he would catch himself, guilt searing through him. This was not his wife, this was her sister. Allowing her presence to comfort him felt like betrayal. Yet beneath his resentment, another truth stirred. For the first time in years, the house no longer felt like a tomb. The shadows seemed lighter, the silence less oppressive. And though Jacob would never admit it aloud, he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel since the grave was lowered into the earth. Hope, unwelcome and dangerous, had slipped quietly into his home with Clara's arrival. The McGraw house, sturdy and wide-shouldered like the man who built it, carried the weight of memory in every corner. To Clara, stepping back inside after years away felt like stepping into a place haunted, not by restless spirits, but by the traces of her sister's life. The parlor still held the embroidered cushions her sister had sewn. The dining table bore faint scratches from countless meals shared. Even the scent of lavender, her sister's favorite, lingered faintly in the curtains, though the oil lamp it came from had long since gone dry. Clara touched each object with reverence. But the effect on Jacob was altogether different. For him, the house was not a comfort but a battlefield. Each reminder was a blade reopening wounds he had worked tirelessly to scar over. When Clara entered a room, the resemblance to his wife became unbearable. From certain angles, in certain lights, she could have been her, yet she was not. That cruel in-between tormented him more than solitude ever had. The first evening, Clara set about making the house warmer. She lit candles, cooked a simple stew, and opened the windows to let in the evening air. Jacob watched in silence, his expression unreadable. The ranch hands, eager for the change, praised her efforts openly. "Feels like the place is alive again," one of them remarked over supper. Jacob's fork froze midway to his mouth. Alive. The word stung, as though implying the house, and by extension his late wife, had been lifeless until Clara's arrival. After supper, Clara ventured into the master bedroom to fetch extra blankets for the hands. The moment she opened the door, the stillness inside pressed down on her like a weight. Everything was untouched. The bedspread, though neatly made, was faded with time. Her sister's shawl still draped the chair by the hearth. On the nightstand rested her Bible, a dried flower crumbling between the pages. It was as if Jacob had frozen the room in time, unwilling to let the past breathe. Clara stood there for a long moment, grief welling up. She whispered softly, "I'll take care of him, sister." "I'll try." Jacob found her there minutes later, her hand resting on the shawl. His face darkened. "You've no right to be in here," he said sharply, his voice cutting like a whip. Clara turned, startled, but did not back down. "Jacob, this house is suffocating you. You can't keep living in a shrine." His jaw tightened. "This isn't your place." Don't presume to understand. But she did understand, perhaps better than anyone. She, too, had lost someone irreplaceable. She, too, carried the ache of absence. Still, she saw what Jacob could not, that grief had turned his home into a prison, and he was its only inmate. Over the following days, the tension grew. Clara moved about the house with purpose, cleaning, cooking, humming softly to herself. Jacob tried to avoid her, throwing himself into the work outside. Yet every evening he returned, and every evening the house felt a little less hollow. The ranch hands noticed, too, exchanging knowing glances when Jacob lingered a little longer at the supper table or when his gaze softened briefly as Clara passed by. Whispers began among them. They remarked on the resemblance, on how Clara seemed born to take her sister's place. One even dared to say aloud what Jacob feared most. "Maybe it's meant to be. Her coming here, looking after the ranch, looking after him." The words reached Jacob's ears like poison. The thought of Clara replacing his wife was intolerable. Yet the cruel truth was undeniable. The more she moved through the house, the more life returned to it. And whether he wanted to admit it or not, the more she stirred something inside him he had sworn would remain buried. The ghosts in the house were no longer just memories of his wife. They were the feelings Clara awakened, the echoes of what once was, and the dangerous possibility of what might yet be. The autumn sun beat hard on the prairie, and the land bore the strain of a season that gave little and took much. The drought had dragged on longer than any of the ranch hands could remember, leaving the soil cracked and the grass withered to dust. The cattle grew thin, their ribs showing through their hides, and the water troughs needed constant filling from wells that threatened to run dry. Every day, Jacob pushed himself harder, as if sheer force of will could command the skies to give rain. Clara watched him from the porch one morning as he worked to mend a broken section of fence. Sweat streaked his brow, his shoulders bowed under the weight of exhaustion. Something in her heart ached at the sight. She knew pride would never allow him to ask for help, but she also knew the ranch could not be run by one man's grief-driven strength alone. Rolling up her sleeves, she joined him in the pasture. Jacob glanced up, startled to see her there with a hammer in hand. "This isn't your work," he said firmly, almost scolding. Clara met his gaze without flinching. "It is if I decide it is." Before he could argue, she set to work driving nails into the post. Her hands blistered quickly, unused to such tasks, but she did not complain. When the hammer slipped and struck her thumb, she cursed under her breath, earning a flicker of amusement from Jacob despite himself. He caught the sound of her laughter, light, determined, unashamed, and for the briefest moment, the heaviness inside him lifted. As the days stretched on, Clara proved herself again and again. She rose before dawn to help cook for the ranch hands, then followed Jacob into the fields. She carried water buckets until her arms shook, rode out with the men to drive straying cattle back, and even braved the dust storms that swept suddenly across the plains. The men began to speak of her with admiration, calling her tough as any cowhand. Some even whispered she had more grit than Jacob, who had become silent and hard where she showed courage and warmth. One evening, as they worked side by side repairing a corral, Clara broke the silence between them. "You don't have to carry all this alone, Jacob," she said softly, her voice nearly lost in the whine of the prairie wind. He tightened the rope he was pulling, his jaw set. "It's my land, my burden." She laid a hand on the beam, close to his, but not touching. It was her land, too. "And now it's mine to care for as much as yours." The word struck him like a blow. For a moment, he almost snapped at her, accused her of overstepping, of daring to insert herself into a life she had no claim to. But when he looked at her, dust clinging to her hair, her eyes fierce with conviction, he could not speak. Instead, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that they both carried grief, though it weighed on them differently. That night, Jacob found himself staring into the fire, her words echoing in his mind. He had tried so hard to lock everyone out, to bear his losses alone. Yet Clara, by sheer stubbornness and will, was cracking through the armor he had forged around himself. She was not replacing his wife, no one could. But she was easing the crushing solitude he had chosen, and part of him, though guilty for it, was grateful. By sharing the burdens of the ranch, Clara was also sharing the burdens of his heart. And though Jacob resisted, he could feel the first threads of connection weaving between them, threads that might one day become a bond strong enough to challenge even the vow he had sworn at a grave. By late autumn, the ranch had begun to feel like a place stirring back to life. Clara's presence had brightened the long evenings, filled the kitchen with the smell of fresh bread and stew, and even coaxed laughter from the ranch hands who had forgotten what it sounded like. Yet with that revival came an inevitable tension. Jacob, though grateful for the help she provided, carried a growing unease. The more Clara wove herself into the fabric of the ranch, the more it felt as though she was also weaving herself into his life in ways he had not permitted. The spark of conflict came one evening after supper. The men had finished eating and drifted back to their quarters, leaving Jacob and Clara alone in the lamplight. Clara set down a ledger on the table, the one Jacob used to track cattle and supply costs. She had gone over it earlier and noticed discrepancies, places where better planning could save money. "You're bleeding coin on feed," she said plainly, her tone not accusatory but firm. "If you sold off the weaker stock before winter, you could stretch what you have and keep the herd stronger." Jacob looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing. "That's my decision," Clara held his gaze. "A decision that could mean the difference between profit and loss, or between survival and ruin." The air in the room tightened. Jacob slammed the ledger shut and pushed it aside. "You think because you've spent a few weeks hauling water and patching fences, you know how to run a ranch? This land has been mine for years, Clara. Don't presume to tell me how to manage it." His words cut, sharp and cold. But Clara, never one to back down, stepped closer, her voice rising with her temper. "This land belonged to my sister, too. She's the one who kept your home alive, who stood at your side through drought and sickness. If she were here, she'd tell you the same thing I'm telling you now. You can't do this alone. You're too stubborn to see it." The mention of his wife pierced Jacob like an arrow. His fists clenched at his sides. "Don't you dare speak for her," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You are not her. You never will be." The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. Clara's breath caught, her eyes shimmering though she fought against tears. She had known, of course, that she was not her sister. But hearing the words spoken aloud in such anger cut deep. She drew herself up, chin lifted, pride shielding her pain. "No, Jacob, I'm not her. But I loved her too. And I won't stand by while you drive yourself and this ranch into the ground because you're too proud to listen." With that, she turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Jacob remained by the table, chest heaving, guilt gnawing at him, though his pride refused to let it show. He had lashed out not because Clara was wrong, but because she was right. Every word had struck too close to the truth he could not face. He was failing, and he needed her more than he dared admit. That night, Clara lay awake in the small guest room, staring at the ceiling. She wondered if she had made a mistake in coming, if her presence only deepened his wounds instead of healing them. Yet beneath her hurt was determination. She would not abandon him, not Jacob, not the ranch, not the memory of the sister they both loved. Jacob, sitting alone by the dying fire, wrestled with his own demons. The image of Clara's defiant eyes haunted him, stirring emotions he had sworn never to feel again. Anger, yes, but also admiration. And something else, something far more dangerous, the stirrings of a heart he had buried. The storm rolled in without warning, sweeping across the prairie with the sudden violence of a wild beast. Winds howled against the ranch house, rattling the shutters, while lightning forked across the darkened sky. Jacob had seen plenty of storms in his life, but this one carried a weight that made even the cattle restless in their pens. The men were already out checking the herds when word came running. Riders had been spotted near the south pasture, men who did not belong. Rustlers. Jacob grabbed his rifle without hesitation, the weariness of recent weeks forgotten in the urgency of the moment. He barked orders to the ranch hands, his voice steady, commanding. Yet when Clara appeared at the doorway, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, insisting she would come too. Jacob's temper flared. "This isn't your fight," he snapped. "Stay inside!" But Clara's eyes burned with defiance. "If they take your herd, Jacob, they take everything. I won't sit idle while you risk your life." Before he could stop her, she had mounted one of the spare horses, clutching the reins with a mixture of determination and fear. Jacob cursed under his breath, but there was no time to argue. Together they rode into the storm, the rain slashing at their faces as the wind whipped around them. They reached the south pasture to find chaos. A band of rustlers, emboldened by the storm, had driven part of the herd toward the open range. The cattle, already panicked by thunder, bawled and stampeded in terror. Jacob raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The men scattered, but one turned back, aiming his revolver toward the rancher. Clara acted before thought could slow her. Urging her horse forward, she swung wide and cracked a whip she'd grabbed from the barn. The sound startled the rustler's horse, throwing the man off balance long enough for Jacob to fire again, this time at the ground near the man's feet, sending him scrambling into the darkness. The others, seeing their companion flee, followed suit. But the danger was not over. A bolt of lightning struck close, spooking the herd into a wild surge. The cattle thundered toward the fencing, threatening to break through. Clara, gripping the reins with white knuckles, rode hard alongside them, her voice rising above the storm as she shouted, coaxed, pleaded. Somehow, miraculously, the herd turned, circling back toward safety. By the time the last cow was secured, the storm had eased into a steady rain. Jacob dismounted, heart pounding, and strode toward Clara. She was still in the saddle, soaked to the bone, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with triumph. For a long moment he could only stare at her, torn between fury and awe. "You could have been killed," he said hoarsely, his hands trembling, not from the cold, but from fear of how close he had come to losing her. Clara slid down from her horse, her legs unsteady. "So could you," she replied, her voice firm. "And what then?" "The ranch would fall, and all your vows and grief wouldn't change that." He caught her by the shoulders, his grip rough, his emotions spilling over. "You're reckless, foolish, you don't understand," but the words faltered. Because she did understand. She had stood in the storm beside him, faced danger without hesitation, and in doing so she had proven she was no mere shadow of her sister, no fragile reminder of what he had lost. She was her own force, unyielding and brave. In the firelight later, as he cleaned the shallow cut on her arm where a rustler's whip had grazed her, Jacob's hands were gentler than his words had been. Clara winced but did not pull away. The closeness was charged, the silence filled with unspoken things neither dared say. Jacob's heart warred within him, his vow of grief against the undeniable truth that life had just shown him. Clara was no longer someone he could ignore. The days after the storm carried a new tension, not from the rustlers who had fled into the night, but from what had passed unspoken between Jacob and Clara. Something had shifted when she rode beside him through lightning and fear, when she bled for his herd as though it were her own. Jacob found himself watching her more often now, when she kneaded bread in the kitchen, when she brushed the horses in the stable, when she laughed with the ranch hands. Each time the stirrings in his chest grew harder to smother, but guilt shadowed him like a relentless specter. At night, lying alone in his bed, Jacob would press his hands over his eyes and whisper to the darkness, "Forgive me." He had sworn at his wife's grave that no other woman would touch his heart, and yet Clara's presence threatened to break that vow. Clara, for her part, wrestled with her own turmoil. The guest room where she slept was small and drafty, its bed hard, the walls closing in like a prison. But it wasn't discomfort that kept her awake. It was loneliness. The ranch house was full of memory, and at night, with the wind howling outside, she felt every inch the outsider. She had come to help, to ease Jacob's burden, but she could not deny what she wanted now, not just to help him, but to stand beside him fully, to share his grief, to share his life. One evening, after the supper dishes were washed and the men had retired, Clara lingered by the fire. Jacob sat across from her, silent as always, staring into the flames. The crackle of burning wood filled the air between them, until at last Clara spoke, her voice steady but soft. "I can't keep sleeping in that room, Jacob." He turned, his brow furrowed. "Then take another." "There are plenty." She shook her head. "That's not what I mean." She met his gaze squarely, no hesitation in her eyes. "I don't want a room to myself. I want yours. I want to be where you are." The words hit him harder than any bullet. His breath caught in his throat, his body tense as a bowstring. For a moment he thought he had misheard, but the clarity in her face told him otherwise. "Clara," he said finally, his voice rough, "you don't know what you're asking." "Yes, I do." She leaned forward, her hands folded tightly in her lap to steady their trembling. "I'm asking you to stop punishing yourself, to stop living in the shadow of a grave. You've carried your grief alone long enough. Let me carry it with you. Let me warm the bed that's grown cold. Not as her replacement, never that, but as myself." Jacob stood, pacing the floor, every step heavy with conflict. His vow echoed in his ears, the memory of his wife's last smile piercing him with guilt. But then he looked at Clara, her face lit by firelight, her eyes fierce and vulnerable all at once, and something inside him cracked. "You think it's that simple?" he asked, almost desperate. "To let you in? To share a bed that's been hers and mine? Every night I've lain there, I've sworn I'd never betray her memory. And you—" His voice broke and he turned away. "You look like her. God help me, sometimes you sound like her, and I can't tell if what I feel is for you or for the ghost of the woman I lost." Clara rose, crossing the room until she stood close enough that he could feel her warmth. Gently she touched his arm. "Then don't choose between us. Love her still, she deserves that. But don't shut yourself off from the living because of the dead. I'm not her shadow, Jacob. I'm flesh and blood. And I'm here." Silence filled the room, heavy, charged. Jacob closed his eyes, torn between guilt and desire, grief and hope. He did not yet have an answer, but Clara's words lodged deep inside him, refusing to be cast aside. For the first time, the bed upstairs no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a question, one Jacob would soon be forced to answer. The fire crackled low in the hearth, throwing long shadows against the log walls. Outside, the prairie lay silent beneath a star-scattered sky, but inside the McGraw house the air was heavy, tense, filled with words unspoken. Jacob sat hunched in his chair, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone white. Across from him, Clara sat with her shoulders squared, her eyes fixed on him as though she could will him to speak. He had avoided her all day after her bold plea to share his bed. He had thrown himself into work, riding the pastures until dusk, mending fences that barely needed repair, anything to keep from facing the truth she had laid bare. But as night fell, he knew he could not outrun it. Clara was not a passing presence. She was here, in his home, in his heart, unsettling vows he had built like stone walls around his grief. Finally, with a weary sigh, Jacob broke the silence. "I don't know how to do this." Clara tilted her head, her voice steady. "Do what?" He stared into the fire, the flames reflected in his tired eyes. "Love you." "Without feeling like I'm betraying her. Every time I look at you, Clara, I see her, and it tears me apart. My heart, what's left of it, feels pulled in two. Part of me is still at her grave, and part of me is here with you." His words were ragged, choked with the weight of years he had buried beneath silence. For the first time since his wife's passing, Jacob wept. Not the quiet, hidden tears of lonely nights, but raw, unrestrained sobs that shook his broad frame. His grief poured out like a flood he had held back too long. Clara rose slowly and knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She did not speak at first, only let him weep, her presence steady and warm. When at last his sobs quieted, she whispered, "Jacob, loving me doesn't mean you stop loving her. Grief doesn't erase love, and love doesn't erase grief. They live side by side. You carry her memory and you can carry me too. One doesn't cancel the other." He turned toward her, his face streaked with tears, searching her eyes for condemnation, for judgment, but found none. Only compassion, fierce and unwavering, I promised her, he whispered brokenly. At her grave, I swore I'd never love another. Clara's fingers tightened around his hand. And she would never want you to chain yourself to loneliness. Do you really believe she'd want you to spend the rest of your life empty, punishing yourself in her name? Jacob, love is not a betrayal. It's survival. The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks up the chimney. Jacob bowed his head, her words sinking deep. For years he had worn his vow like armor, believing it honored his wife's memory. But in truth it had become a prison, one that starved not only him but the home they had once shared. And Clara, stubborn and unyielding, was prying open the door he had locked. He reached for her hand, rough from work, yet trembling like a boy's. I don't know if I can give you all of me, he admitted. Too much of me still belongs to her. Clara smiled sadly, her thumb brushing over his calloused knuckles. Then give me what you can. I don't need all of you today. Just enough to know you'll let me stand beside you. The rest will come in time. Jacob drew a long, shuddering breath. For the first time since he laid flowers on his wife's grave, he felt something shift inside him. Not the end of grief, but the beginning of acceptance. The firelight flickered over their joined hands, casting them in a glow that seemed to promise a future he had once believed impossible. That night, as the embers burned low, Jacob McGraw allowed himself a truth he had long denied. His heart, though scarred, was still capable of beating for the living. The sun had barely risen when the whispers began. In a small town, little could stay secret, and the news that Clara had moved into Jacob McGraw's bed spread faster than wildfire across dry grass. By midday, the blacksmith's wife clucked her tongue over her wash. The saloon-keeper leaned across his bar with raised brows, and the preacher's wife shook her head so hard her bonnet ribbons flapped in protest. Shameless, some murmured. A man taking up with his wife's sister, disgraceful. Others muttered darker things, saying Clara must have schemed for Jacob's heart all along. Jacob had expected gossip, but the weight of it struck harder than he thought. As he rode into town with Clara to buy supplies, every set of eyes seemed to follow them. He could feel the judgment in the tight-lipped stares, the hushed voices that ceased when he entered a room. His chest tightened with a familiar shame, as if he had indeed betrayed the woman buried on the hill. Clara, however, carried herself differently. Her chin was high, her back straight, her steps firm against the dusty boardwalk. She acknowledged stares with a nod, ignoring whispers as though they were no more than the wind. Inside the general store, she spoke clearly to the clerk, ordering flour, coffee, and lamp oil. Her voice steady, despite the way folks lingered just to hear her speak. When they stepped outside, Jacob muttered, "We should have waited. Let things settle before—" Clara turned sharply, her eyes flashing. "Before what? Before I stood beside you? Before I lived honestly instead of in shadows?" She planted her hands on her hips, daring him to look away. "Jacob, if we hide, they win. They'll say we're ashamed. Are you ashamed of me?" The question struck him like a blow. He swallowed, glancing at the small cluster of townsfolk pretending not to eavesdrop. His instinct was to shield Clara, to protect her from scorn by pulling her back into the shadows. But the fire in her gaze reminded him of the stormy night she had faced bandits without flinching. Clara was not a woman who cowered. "No," he said finally, his voice rough but certain. "I'm not ashamed of you." The declaration didn't silence the whispers. If anything, it stirred them louder. That evening, the saloon was buzzing with talk of Jacob McGraw parading his wife's sister through town like a prize. Some men sneered, others laughed, a few even muttered envy that Jacob had found love again. But amidst the noise, one truth rang clear. The town had judged them. Back at the ranch, Clara sat by the lamplight sewing a torn shirt. Her movements were calm, but Jacob could see the faint tremor in her hands. He crouched beside her, laying a hand over hers. "They don't know you," he said quietly. "They don't know what you've done for me, for this ranch. All they see is scandal." Clara looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Then let them see more. Let them see I won't run, that I'm here because I love you, not because I'm desperate or shameless." I'll stand with you, Jacob. But you have to stand with me. Her words pierced through his uncertainty. For years, Jacob had stood alone, shielding himself from pain by keeping the world at arm's length. Now, with Clara's hand in his, he understood. This was not just about survival, but about claiming the right to live again, even if others scorned them. The town's judgment would not vanish overnight, but Jacob resolved that their voices would no longer dictate his life. As long as Clara remained at his side, he would endure the whispers, the sneers, the sideways glances. That night, as they extinguished the lamp and the ranch settled into silence, Jacob felt something stronger than shame stir in his chest. Pride. Pride in Clara's courage, and pride in the life they were daring to build, no matter what others said. The morning broke golden over the wide expanse of the McGraw Ranch, painting the rolling hills in soft light. Jacob stood on the porch, his hands resting on the rail, watching the sun rise. For years, dawn had brought only another day of labor, another reminder of absence, another shadow of grief. But today, though the ache of loss still lingered in his chest, there was also something else, a quiet warmth, a new beginning. Inside, Clara moved about the kitchen, humming softly as she baked biscuits. The sound drifted out the open door, settling around Jacob like a balm. It was not the same tune his wife once sang, not the same voice, but it was alive, bright, and wholly Clara's. For the first time, Jacob didn't compare. He simply listened. After breakfast, Jacob saddled his horse and asked Clara to ride with him. She hesitated, brushing flour from her hands. Into town again? After yesterday? He nodded, his jaw set with quiet determination. Yes, we can't keep dodging their stares. It's time I made things clear. Clara searched his face, then slowly smiled. All right, let's face them together. The ride into town was steady, the sound of hooves echoing on hard-packed earth. Jacob rode tall in the saddle, Clara beside him with her bonnet tied firm. When they reached Main Street, heads turned, conversations halted, and once again the weight of every eye fell upon them. But this time, Jacob didn't shrink. He dismounted, helped Clara down, and led her toward the center of the dusty street where several townsfolk had gathered near the mercantile. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying strong and even. You all know me, he began. You knew my wife, God rest her soul. You know how much I loved her. That hasn't changed, and it never will. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded solemnly. Others folded their arms. Jacob tightened his grip on Clara's hand, feeling her steady him. But life doesn't stop because a man grieves, he continued. Clara came here to help, and in time she gave me more than help. She gave me hope. Some of you whisper it's wrong, that it's scandal. I say it's life, and I won't be ashamed of it any longer. He turned toward Clara then, his voice softening but still carrying for all to hear. This woman stands by me, not out of obligation, but because she chooses to. And I choose her. She's my partner, my heart, and I'll not hide it another day. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the creak of a sign swinging in the breeze. Some faces hardened, but others softened. The preacher's wife pursed her lips, but said nothing. The blacksmith gave a small nod, and a ranch hand from a neighboring spread tipped his hat with a faint smile. Clara's eyes glistened, her hand trembling in Jacob's. She had stood strong for so long, but hearing him speak openly, proudly, brought tears she could no longer hold back. Later, as they rode home, she leaned against him in the saddle, whispering, "You've no idea what that meant to me." Jacob kissed the top of her head, a gesture simple yet profound. I meant every word. Back at the ranch, the men greeted them without hesitation. A few even offered nods of respect, as if Jacob's declaration had given them permission to set aside their doubts. Life would go on, with work to be done, cattle to raise, and seasons to weather. But something had shifted. The ranch no longer felt like a tomb of memories. It felt alive again. That evening, as the sky blazed red with sunset, Jacob and Clara stood side by side on the porch. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. For the first time since loss had hollowed him, Jacob McGraw felt not just the weight of grief, but the promise of tomorrow. A new dawn had come, and he welcomed it, not as a betrayal of the past, but as a tribute to love's enduring power to heal and to begin again.